For the sake of our internet audience, let me just tell you it's Easter here, and we are enjoying a performance of Jesus Christ Superstar, which we cannot put on the web, so you should make plans to be here next Easter when we do it again. But if we put it on our YouTube channel, someone would sue us till we bleed through our feet, so you get me. In the parlance of religion, we talk a lot about a concept we call redemptive suffering. That is, like the beatings of Martin Luther King Jr., his imprisonment in Alabama, his eventual murder, these were redemptive in the sense that his suffering helped to empower the civil rights movement that changed the fate of the entire world. The beatings, imprisonment, and the final murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero were not meaningless. His willingness to suffer on behalf of the poor of El Salvador helped to alleviate the oppression of the poor in Central America. Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa both lived lives of abject poverty, suffering day in and day out during their entire long lives in order to lift the plight of the poor in New York City and in Calcutta. Gandhi's hunger strikes, his beatings and imprisonment at the hand of the British Army, and finally his execution, helped to liberate the entire subcontinent of India. Today on Easter, if we were to draw back the curtain of centuries of manipulative mythology, wishful thinking, we can see that the arrest, the torture, and the death of Jesus of Nazareth have also been similarly redemptive. Not because the blood cult, that there was some angry demonic god that demanded a blood sacrifice to gain our forgiveness, but rather that he was willing to stand up to the power of the greatest empire that the world had ever seen at that time, that he was willing to spend his own life defending the impoverished and oppressed nation. I think that the event of the cross was a historical fact, although most everything that we've been told about that event in Sunday school and in church for most of our lives has not just been simply false and misleading, but in many cases it has actually been quite damaging. As dated as many people might think the lyrics of the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar may be, and I show it in my courses in college when I teach the life and teachings of Jesus, and college students oftentimes laugh at the costumes and the dance routines, and yet I can tell you that the writers of Superstar had a much more clear grasp on the historical theology of the Jesus story than most pastors, and I would have to say most seminary professors do today. The torture and execution of Jesus of Nazareth was a sad event. It was wrong. It was murder. It was an example of state-sponsored torture. But thankfully, his death was also redemptive, in that his martyrdom has inspired centuries, millions, who have since his time had the courage to stand up to repressive governments, controlling corporations, employers, slave owners, and, if I may add, organized religion. Unfortunately, redemptive suffering is only the thinnest slice of the overall horizon of human suffering. Earlier this week, 34 people were killed in Brussels in 3 ISIS-coordinated bombings that left another 200 people injured. This was senseless. These were not people who were challenging oppression. They were not marching in a civil rights protest. They were on their way to work. They were going to school. Some people had just dropped off their parents to go home. They were on vacation. They were visiting family. They were on their way to the grocery store. This was not martyrdom. This was just murder. It's been a year since Graham Wood's much heralded article, What ISIS Really Wants, was published in the Atlantic Monthly. In light of this recent terrorist attack in Europe, I think we could stand to review some of the myths that Wood's article exposed. Terrorists are not simply angry, unemployed thrill seekers. They are not greedy materialists who have hijacked a religion to make their greed appear acceptable. In fact, ISIS is led by people who are sincerely religious and are devoted to a very specific form of Islam that has taken an extremely lethal them and us worldview. They are wanting to reverse the world order in which the Western democracies and economies have dominated the world through either secularism or Judeo-Christian mindsets. They want to flip that over and create a Muslim caliphate that would put an extremist version of Islam at the top of the world's power pyramid. They believe, in fact, that it is their turn. So when they attack Western targets, what they're trying to do is to provoke a deeper them and us reality, to both warn Muslims not to flee to the West and to try to incite the West into war. They want to provoke a war. They want to provoke border closings, the building of fences and walls, or to do as Ted Cruz has suggested, begin to put spies in mosques and in Muslim neighborhoods to begin to spy on American citizens, fostering the idea that they're not really one of us. They're not really Americans. Even the 1,000 Muslims that serve in the armed forces in uniform, we want to make them feel like they are somehow not quite up to par. I have to say that Wednesday morning, watching the news, it looked very much to me like Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski were actually on the payroll of ISIS. They were promoting the kind of fear that ISIS wants to provoke. Terrorism is intended to provoke terror. And Joe and Mika were doing everything they could to provoke terror on behalf of ISIS. They were giving ISIS credit for power and influence that they clearly do not have. They wanted to trick the West into believing that they are bigger and stronger than they are. There's not more than 30,000 people involved in all of ISIS army. There's 300,000 just in the army of Egypt. They are surrounded by armies that are much larger than they are. ISIS simply is the JV team. That's why they don't strike in military ways. They strike as terrorists with suicide bombers. It is the only way that they can get attention. But what Joe and Mika were saying could have been a script written by the PR people at ISIS. They were doing everything they could to make Americans as afraid as ISIS wants us to be. So MSNBC executives, if you're listening, consider this to be your last warning. What they did report on March 22nd was that ISIS killed 34 people in Brussels. What they did not say is that the week before, ISIS had killed 35 people in Ankara, Turkey. And the week before that, they'd killed 47 in Baghdad. And in January, there were 50 killed in Libya. And since the Brussels bombing, there's been another suicide bombing in Beirut, killing dozens. The majority of victims of ISIS are not Western Christians. They are Middle Eastern Muslims who are peace-loving, hardworking people who are just trying to get an education for their children, pay for a house, and feed their family the same way that the people in the airport in Brussels were. The hundreds of thousands of refugees who are streaming out of Syria are not bringing jihad with them. They are fleeing jihad. They are trying to get away from the same people that we are worried about. They are victims, just like the victims in Paris and in Belgium. So to be honest, ISIS actually does have a point. We don't make Muslims as human as we do immigrants from Western Europe. When 130 people were killed in Paris last fall, we flew French flags. Even out here in this neighborhood in Missouri, there were people that had huge French flags flying, and everyone was saying, "Je suis Paris," I am a Parisian. But that same year, there were 137 people killed in Yemen. No one was saying, "Ana Yemeni." They're not wrong in their belief that we have not accepted them as equals. Our news reporting leaves no doubt that we value the lives of white Northern Europeans 1,000 times more than we value the lives of dark-skinned people in the Middle East and Africa. I wish it wasn't so obviously true, but it is undeniable. But in the reaction of the corporate media, if you're willing to agree with me, and of course I've got the only active microphone right now, so it looks like absolutely unanimous agreement, that what the media said was wrong, and the manipulation of Homeland Security Agency. Look, folks, Homeland Security, which works for us ostensibly, but they use terrorist attacks to try to get us to give up more of our privacy, more of our civil rights, so that Big Brother can protect us from the scary, scary brown people. So if that's all wrong, what is right? Oh, and Tim Cook at Apple, if you're watching, don't you dare let the CIA have a back door into my iPhone. They don't have any business invading the privacy of every American. That's what fascist regimes do, and we are not fascist. If you want to see the right reaction to terrorism, I think the people of Brussels and Paris are giving us good examples. They're holding marches against fear. Not marches against Islam, not marches to protest for greater defenses or for us to bomb the Middle East until the sand becomes a mirror. They're marching against fear. They are refusing to change their daily lives. They're refusing to surrender their pluralistic society, their free Europe in which people cross national boundaries without passports. They are refusing to live in fear of murderous criminals. And on that vein, let me throw some roses at our president. I don't often get to praise elected officials, so I want to do it when I have a good chance. President Obama was in Cuba trying to peacefully and mercifully bring an end to the Cold War that hasn't made any sense for 30 or 40 years and has caused the suffering of millions of people in Cuba. He was right not to change his itinerary, not to run back to Washington and act scared because some misguided lunatics had blown themselves up in Brussels. I was glad when he went to a baseball game and showed the world that we are made of sterner stuff than his critics who were at least verbally soiling their pants. However, the staff member that allowed him to be led to the dance floor to tango in Argentina, I would like to have the honor of firing that person myself. That was a bridge too far. And President Obama, if you're listening, we don't ever want to see that again. You've heard me say this before, but on this Easter Sunday, in the wake of these recent terrorist acts, it deserves to be said again. Even though in modern Christianity the word faith is often used to mean the equivalent of assassinating your brains and making yourself believe childish myths and superstitions that no thinking person could believe, in fact, the word faith in its original context did not mean that. In Greek, the word is pistis. In the early days of the church, when someone was being baptized, they were making a decision to stand in the face of the power of the Roman Empire. They were oftentimes having to stand up to their family's indigenous organized religion. And so when they were lowered into the water and brought up, they shouted the word pistis, which means courage. Courage to stand against oppression, courage to stand against those that want us to live in fear in servile lives. They had the courage to embrace a way of living that was resurrection in the face of overwhelming power. If I could give you anything on earth, if I could give you a gift of anything in the face of this us and them violent mentality that has divided the world, it would be that you would just stop being afraid. Just stop being scared. Sure, we should be smart about border security. We should use the best intelligence technology and information sharing that we can to find as many bad guys as we can. But ultimately, what beats the bad guys is if you refuse to let them incite you into fear and anger. If you refuse to retaliate by going to war. If you refuse to simply be afraid. If we have the courage not to hate, even when we are hated, to try not to bomb the Middle East until they like us better, if we can learn to include rather than exclude, to love rather than to hate, to embrace rather than to fear, then, my friends, maybe the whole world will be able to celebrate an Easter resurrection. That's just my opinion, but I'm probably not wrong.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.